Morning. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here, albeit very briefly, since I have a high school graduation of one of my kids tomorrow morning that I would have hell to pay if I missed that. So I'm going to leave earlier than most folks will, but I'm happy to be here, and thanks to the Stanford team, Charles and Stephanie and others for including me. And by the way, I did not put my graphs for my paper into my PowerPoint, so it would probably help you turn to page 14, and I'll refer to a couple of graphs there. So I'm going to be looking at declining employment rates and especially labor force activity among millennials relative to others. Briefly, what are the trends? What do the basic facts look like? What seem to be the causes of those trends? And say at least a few things about policy. Just to clarify what I'm going to focus on, I'm going to be comparing labor force trends for millennials, who are roughly 25 to 34-year-olds in my work, relative to those who are 35 to 54, who mostly constitute Gen Xers. And these two categories together constitute what we often call prime age workers. We're going to be comparing their trends to each other. Just to keep in mind, though, before I get there, two important things we've known for a long time. Number one, any external factor, either positive or negative, like the Great Recession that Charles mentioned, is always going to hit younger people harder in terms of their employment activity. And then number two, any loss of employment activity is probably going to hurt the earnings of younger people more, because those early years of 25 to 34 are so important in terms of when workers make their most progress in terms of rising earnings. So it's sort of a double whammy that any negative shock is on both dimensions likely to hurt younger workers more. Now, I'm not going to focus on youth, on 16 to 24-year-olds, because their trends are very heavily influenced by enrollment patterns. Of course, people 25 and over increasingly are also enrolling, but it affects their labor force activity much less. Most people, older students, tend to also be in the workforce. I'm going to not talk directly about cyclical changes in the sense I'm going to compare 3 points in time, 1996, 2006, and 2016, all of which were close to a cyclical peak. So the numbers I compare are taken at the same point in the business cycle. But of course, as Charles has already mentioned, in between those second and third dates, there was this Great Recession that seems to be having lasting impacts. I will look at variation by gender and also by education, which is quite important in this story. I'm not going to look at earnings numbers. I think Christine is going to look at that. But actually, wage developments do figure quite prominently in this story as well. And I'm going to highlight 4 important trends. Number one, labor force activity has been declining among all prime age workers, Gen Xers as well as millennials, a bit more among the millennials than among the Gen Xers. Number two, once you break it down by gender, the declines for men, for male millennials, is much stronger than the declines for women. It's actually striking how strong that decline is. But number three, even though women aren't declining nearly as much, their levels remain much lower than those of men, and there's a lack of progress. It's flattened out at a very low level. Now, on other dimensions of earnings or education, women are making more progress, but they are not improving their labor force activity at this point. And number four, education's a really important part of this story as well. Large differences across education groups within each gender. So now let me start to talk a little bit about the numbers. And you can look at figure 1 on page 14. The solid lines are the millennials. The dashed lines are the Gen Xers. Men are the top lines. Women are the bottom lines, and aggregate in the middle. So the first thing that you notice is that the decline in activity, labor force activity over this 20-year period among the millennials is a little bit steeper than the decline among the Gen Xers. It's about a 2.5 percentage point drop for the millennials, about 1.8% drop for the older prime age workers. So not enormously different, a little bit worse. But remember, I said any drop hurts the earnings, is more likely to scar younger workers if it occurs rather than older workers. So it is a reason for concern. Notice that for many groups, including the millennials, the decline gets a little steeper after the Great Recession. Economists call that hysteresis, when a temporary event creates permanent scars for people, and there does seem to be quite a bit of evidence of hysteresis, especially for the millennials, who entered the labor market at that time, as Charles said. But once you break it down by gender, if you look at the males in the top part of that chart, you see the much steeper decline. It's actually a 4.4 percentage point decline in labor force activity. That's a large decline over a 20-year period. If you look at then the female bars, there's much less of a decline. I think for the millennial women, it's just a bit over a 1 percentage point decline. But again, that's not any reason to celebrate because the female rates are so much lower, about 15 percentage points lower than those of men. And so the real news on women is not so much that it's declining, but it's that they flattened out at such a low level compared to the men. This is in contrast to most previous decades, up until around the year 2000, when women were making strong progress in labor force activity. It's in contrast to other dimensions where they continue to make progress. And it's really in contrast to many other countries, many other industrial countries, where women's participation continues to gain. And the United States, female labor force activity is falling relative to many of these other countries. And there's a good reason for that I'll talk about in a minute. Not a good reason, but an understandable reason. If you look at figure 2 on page 15, I break it down by gender. So these are only for millennials. These are not trends. These are the snapshot as of 2016. And here there's one story, very large differences in labor force activity by level of education, with college grads working much more than people with only high school or less than high school. You see that both among men and women. The gaps are actually a little larger for women. College grads of both genders in this age group, 25 to 34, work at quite high levels. The female numbers for high school grads are about 68%, and for high school dropouts, only 50%. And I'll talk about what I think the causes of that are in a minute. For males, it's 85% for high school graduates and 70% for high school dropouts. So again, the males are working at much higher rates than the women, 15 to 20 percentage points higher. Nevertheless, they are much lower than the work activity among men with college degrees. And I want to make two comments about those two numbers for men. Because you might be looking at those numbers and say, well, it's not so bad. It's not such a disaster. Two things. Number one, the 70% for male high school dropouts almost certainly overstates the real number. Because so many men of color, low-income men with criminal records, do not show up in the population data, right? So if you included those men, it would bring that number down by quite a bit. And the 85% number is disturbing in the following sense. And if you adjusted that number for unemployment, as well as labor force inactivity, it'd be more like 80%. The 20% of men not working at any point in time, in contrast to the women, tend to not be doing anything productive. They're not enrolled in college, neither are the women, because this is, otherwise they'd be in the some college category. By and large, what the survey data showed, they're not taking care of kids at home. They're not taking care of the home itself. They're really not doing anything that we might consider a productive investment, which most of the women are. So that 20% of this male group is really, when you look at the numbers and how they spend their time, I'm not saying that's a causal factor, but it's really not engaging in any kind of productive investments. It's a lot of waste of activity. And then, of course, if you look at the trend numbers over time, the largest declines are for men and women with high school or less education. Now, I want to say something. We hear a lot about millennial college grads and their struggles and their difficulties, and I want to minimize any of that. There's student debt issues that others will talk about later and other things. But in any relative sense, the real issue, the real crisis is for people with high school or less. And I think that's where we really want to focus our resources the most and our policy activity. Very quickly, what are the causes of these trends? There's a literature on all of this stuff. The literature doesn't always focus directly on millennials, but again, they are the most sensitive to whatever's going on. For women, the story of childbearing and child rearing seems to be a big part of the story for less educated women. And the lack of paid family leave in the United States. There was a very important study, I think, by Sandy Black and Diane Schanzenbach a couple of years ago from the Hamilton Project at Brookings, doing a cross-country comparison. And the changes in labor force activity are quite highly correlated with the countries that provide some kind of serious paid family leave. So that seems to be a major story there. And we know, and I think the demographers will back me up on this, that highly educated young women tend to postpone both marriage and childbearing. You start to see some of it, of course, between 30 and 34, whereas less educated women may or may not get married, but either way, they tend to not postpone their childbearing. And I think that's the biggest source of those low numbers for less educated women among millennials. For men, there's several other factors, and I've already mentioned the Great Recession, which no doubt is a big part of the story, and the hysteresis effects. But there's 4 other things that show up. And by the way, the latest issue of the Journal of Economic Perspectives has 3 very good papers by economists and sociologists on this issue, and I think these 4 causal factors are very prominent in those studies. Number 1, declining wages, stagnant or declining wages, especially facing the men. And it's what economists call a labor supply effect, where people withdraw some of their labor force activity because the wages are less attractive than they used to. And that's a very big change from the past. Because historically, what I learned in grad school was prime age men work full time. That's it. High wages, low wages, it doesn't matter. We used to say their labor supply is inelastic. That's changing. They are more responsive now to labor market rewards. Secondly, other sources of non-labor market income, the biggest of which seems to be disability insurance, SSDI. Now, I think that's going to be less of a factor for millennials than for older folks dropping out of the labor market because disability take-up rises with age. On the other hand, I think if these guys are out of the labor market for a long time, 10, 15 years down the road, that's where they're headed. And there's other sources of non-labor market income. It could be spousal earnings, it could be food stamps, et cetera. There seems to be a rise in informal, sporadic labor market activity that people are starting toward among this group who's formally out of the labor force. Number 3, specific barriers to labor force for men of color, especially African-American men. Of course, criminal records is the dominant factor. Among the white working class, as we've heard a lot recently, opioids and substance abuse problems more broadly. Of course, if you combine the opioids issues with the disability issues, you have rising morbidity and rising mortality in the white working class, and other economists like Angus Deaton and Ann Case have talked about this, what they call deaths of despair, rising as well. And finally, regional differences in labor markets. There have always been regional differences in America, some places doing better than others. Today, the gaps are bigger across regions, the gaps are longer lasting, and people are moving less away from those declining regions. So a chunk of the people not in the labor market are stuck in these regions and not going anywhere else. So I think I have maybe a minute or 2 left at most. What does all this say about policy? So I've tried to write down a set of policies, each of which targets the set of causes I just mentioned before. The first category is, make work pay, paid family leave, I think. If you're worried about female labor force participation, needs to be at the top of that agenda. And of course, even Ivanka Trump has jumped on this bandwagon, so there is some bipartisan agreement, a little less agreement as always on exactly what to do and even more importantly how to pay for it, but there's at least some consensus on that. And for low wage earners in general, the set of policies we call make work pay can be important. The Earned Income Tax Credit, the EITC, has been a very successful policy, but childless adults or people who have children but don't have custody get very, very little of that. That's high on the agenda to expand EITC for childless adults. Now, raising the minimum wage is another make work pay policy. I tend to support moderate minimum wage increases. I'm a little more nervous about 15. The problem, I think, with going to 15 in a lot of places is that it may draw workers into the labor market, but employers will be less likely to want to hire them. We can talk about that afterwards if anyone wants, and what does the literature show on that. And then I have 4 more bullet points to really match the 4 I had for men. Number 1, increasing the attainment of sub-BA credentials with labor market value. Here, the primary place to look is community colleges. I think more resources would help, stronger incentives to pay attention to the labor market. Also, sector-based training programs for high-demand sectors like healthcare, also apprenticeships. There's a whole range of things we could be doing to raise the earnings of people without BAs. Next, reducing both the number and the stigma associated with criminal records and opioid dependency. I don't know anything about the opioid dependency. I know a little bit about criminal records. We can talk about what those things would be. I'll tell you in advance, I don't think ban the box should be high on that list. So I'll tell you all the things I don't believe in that maybe would generate a little controversy. Then subsidized jobs in the depressed sectors, perhaps as part of broader economic development strategies. But again, I wouldn't pour huge amounts of money into, I distinguish between rural areas and smaller metro areas not that far from big, I think there's a lot more hope for the latter than the former. Finally, I would do some SSDI reform. I think there's good reason to do that, but I would not doing it unless it were tied to some of the other more progressive policies I've listed above. I think I'm out of time. Thank you very much.